Yeah.
A general question as far as like succeed and user.
Okay.
So because user is a record,
Yes.
if I guess just in general in Elm REPL, if I say user, is that a function?
Yes. That'll be a function from int to string to user.
So the ordering of how you defined each item in the record is important, and that's what's used for like each item in the pipeline.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So the order in which you define these corresponds to the argument order of in the function. Yeah.
So how do you stumble upon like, oh, this is going to be a nullable string? I mean, you just have to know your data really well.
Yeah, for sure. So the question was, how do you know that something is or is not going to be nullable? There's two possible approaches there. One is to know your data really well. So like to have a schema from the back end and be like, okay, I know this one can be null or it cannot be null, for sure. Another possibility is to be pessimistic and to say, you know what? I don't really know if the person who implemented this is going to be good about null or not. So I'm just going to handle that. I'm going to make all of these nullable, and then I'm going to decode them into, usually if you're doing something like that, you're going to make an intermediate data structure. So I might call it like JSON user or something like that, where everything's maybe. And then as a follow-up step, after decoding into that intermediate representation, I'd say, okay, now let me go through and resolve all these maybes and be like, okay, if this one's none, how do I want to handle that? Or nothing, how do I want to handle that? If this one is, how do I want to handle that? Some cases you may not be able to handle it, so maybe you have to fail decoding in that case. But the point is, it's also possible to just be pessimistic and assume that it always potentially could be null and figure out some reasonable default or error to show. Great questions. Fun fact, we actually took the former approach where we were very strict about this, and if decoding would ever fail when we got data back from the server, we would log it as an error. And we actually ended up discovering bugs in our Ruby code where we thought that we were not possibly sending nil, but accidentally we were sometimes. And because the decoder would fail, then we'd get an error message about it, like, oops, go fix that. It's like the only time I've heard of front end discovering bugs in the back end. Okay, so to recap, we talked about decoding as a general concept. Decode string int 5, that will result in either giving us back OK, in which case we have the number 5, or error, in which case it'll explain why the string that we gave didn't work out. Those are examples of the two variants in result. So result has two type variables. One is the error type, and the other is the OK type, and two variants, each of which uses each of those. We talked about pipeline decoding, which is using the pipeline that we learned from the previous section in the context of specifying sort of a schema for how we expect our JSON to look and how we're going to translate that schema, translate that JSON into our particular Elm type, assuming everything actually lines up and it works out in practice. And finally, we talked about optional and nullable, which are ways to deal with the possibility that we either got null when we weren't expecting it, or we got a missing field that we thought was there, but which we want to be resilient to. We want for it to be okay for that field to be missing.